Hello, Ken Spriggs here with a one video build for a new commission that I took up about a month ago to build another version of the little mini pod that I did for the Discovery build that I just completed. And I had posted pictures and videos of that on Facebook, and I got several requests actually to do commissions, several for a new Discovery, which quite honestly I don't want to get into again anytime soon. Maybe somewhere down the road in a few years, but it's a very complex build, and it took about a year to build, and I'm not looking to do that. I don't build commissions for a living, and quite honestly, it's not as profitable as you might think it would be. But I do it if it interests me and it's something that I want to work on. Like I definitely wanted to work on my Discovery again because I wanted to use the nicer interior sets, and do a better job than I did on my first one, which I was real pleased with. So, and I didn't mind doing this one either because it gave me a bit of a challenge, because the client only wants the little teeny pod, which is about a ½ inch in diameter. He's not putting it with the Discovery. He's not putting it on a ship. He just wants it on a base with lights, of course, and the little Frank figure. So I worked out an idea to come up with something to make a cool looking base that would go with it. So let's go ahead and take a look. All right, so I'm working on a base to hold the little mini pod up and display it. This isn't going to be going with a ship for this particular client. He just wanted the pod as a standalone. So I came up with an idea of how to make a little curved base that looks like the top of the command sphere. So I took, first of all, this thin plastic. It's basically just an open ornament that it was all one sphere, of course, with a little stem at the top. You could put glitter in it or other kind of things and just make an ornament for your Christmas tree. It's easy to work with as far as cutting out, and it's very flexible. So I cut out a sphere and I made it about the right size, and I put it on top of the Discovery that I'm building and finishing up, my Discovery build that I finished up recently. And I just drew some rough lines with some felt tip marker to kind of rough out the panels. Now initially I was playing with an idea of gluing in a battery holder, and you can see the hot glue there. It just kind of deformed it and started melting it and warping it, so that didn't work. Plus I was having a hard time gluing anything onto this. It's a strange kind of plastic, so it's really hard to work with. So what I'm going to try to do, and here's the second one I did, that I started cutting out, and you can see where I drew the different panels and lines that I'd be cutting loose. There's a top one right there that'll go on the top. So what I decided to try instead, when I bought this one, I also bought this really thick, hard plastic one. It comes in 2 halves. A lot sturdier, nicer plastic. And I think this will work better. So what I'm going to do is cut out, it's just slightly bigger than this one, but I think it'll be fine. I'm going to go ahead and put this on top of the dome, trace it out, and cut out one and start working with that one instead. I think that'll work better as far as getting a nice base that's a little more solid that I can glue like a battery holder underneath as well. So, okay. All right, so I decided to try to do something with the thin styrene for the top of the dome rather than using this clear piece from my original attempt. Just because this plastic is really hard to work with. It doesn't want to glue down right, and I'm just nervous. It's hard to get a really smooth edge on it, so styrene is much better. So I had a piece that I cut out that was the same size, but it's really hard to get the flat styrene to conform around that compound top edge. I can get one curve, but getting the whole curve around is really hard. So I took some of the remaining masking from the Aztec dummy mask set, and I just put some random triangles around it to get a circle. Now what I'm going to do is cut those pieces out, so I'm dealing with smaller little pieces that'll be easier to have a curve in them and glue onto the top. And once I get the top piece done, the rest of the pieces coming down are going to just be one curve, just a slight curve to for a compound, so it won't be quite as bad to try to get that lined up. So okay. All right, there we go. That worked really well. So cutting it into the little wedges made it a lot easier to conform them down onto the curve. And I'm glad I went with this more styrene type plastic, which is easier to glue to, and it's much more solid. So I just numbered them all, cut them into wedges, tried to keep them in kind of the order of where I was doing the masks, but once this dries thoroughly, I'll take some sandpaper and sand that down fine and smooth so I finish up any rough edges. But it's generally nicely curved, as it's supposed to be. May or may not be centered at the top, but I'm not going to worry about it. It looks pretty good to me. Just eyeballed it. So let me finish that, and then I'll be able to start working on the other pieces, which I started to cut out a little bit of, like this one here, and then start gluing those. There's a sizable gap between the top panel and these ones, so I'm going to make sure that I leave a big enough gap and just make sure it looks even when I go all around. So that'll be the way to go. That'll be easier to put these on. It'll be easier to sand it all down and make it look all uniform once I get it painted. So all right, fantastic. All right, now that that's dried, I sanded it down with 180 grit sandpaper, get most of the rough edges down. Then I went back over it again with some 400 grit to make it a lot smoother. And it's a nice and smooth now. I'm not really sure if you can make out the lines that are separating the little wedges, but it's not a problem. Once I get some primer on it, if the lines are still there and visible, that's just where I'll line up the same wedges, which I kept, and then do the same thing as far as painting it a dark gray, then put the wedge down, painting it lighter, put some more down, and so on. So I can get the same pattern around the sphere, just like it did on my larger Discovery, the actual Discovery. So what I'm working on right now is starting to add some pieces around the sides. So I put this little bit here, which is this really thin styrene stock. Now, just like with that one, if I try to stretch it too long or even totally around it, it wouldn't work. It would be bowing in certain parts and it wouldn't stick down right. It wouldn't look right. But if I do small pieces like this, I can get away with it and I can glue it down so it conforms to the curve. And this plastic is really nice. As you can see, I sanded it down to a nice beveled edge. It's nice and even. I did that mostly by just rubbing it along a piece of sandpaper until I got a nice smooth edge to where I wanted it to be. And then I have the lines on. The lines don't have to be perfect. The panels don't have to be perfect. It just has to have that look. Get a better look at that. It's kind of hard to see that. There we go. But these panels are fairly accurate. Well, let me put it this way. These panels are accurate to the Mobius kit. Now, whether that's accurate to the movie, I don't know. But that's what I'm going with. And so what I'm doing right now is I have this piece, because what I did was I started to cut out the other ones, which I'm not going to end up using. This thin one that I started with. So the second one that I made up, sorry, hold on one second, falling all over the place here. So the second one with the thinner plastic that I started cutting up, I drew the lines on that as well. And so what I can do is I cut out a panel like, say, this one right here. And that's what I did with this. And then I just put it along this thin styrene, and I cut that out, and then I just kind of curve it a bit. And what I'm doing right now is I'm cutting out, let's see, it's going to go right here. You can see where that little lines are, little squares. That just means that something was cut. There was an extra separate pieces. So I cut that out of there. I may even cut that a little bit bigger. And then I'll cut these pieces and put them back in and have a little bit of a gap between them to look like some panel lines, that sort of thing. But I'll first glue this onto here, and then it's also going to have that circle in it, which is like one of the exhaust jets that you have two of them on the top. All right, so let me work on that a little bit, get that glued on in place, and then slowly I'll just start to build the panels around the sphere. All right, so work is coming along really well on my base that I'm scratch building to look like the top of the command sphere. So I've been cutting out one piece at a time from this original thin styrene to get the general shape. And then what I do is I take that and I just fit it up against the parts. I started with one thing and I'm just working my way around so they're all in order. And then I just line it up. And once I get it to be the right shape, maybe a couple adjustments, I press it against some thin styrene and I cut it out. And then if it has a certain panel, like this one has that little panel to the top left, I just cut that out and I'll just glue them on separately. And then I take it and I just wrap it around this X-Acto knife until I get a little bit of a curve in it. It's hard to get the curve sideways, so I'm doing the up and down, and then I just let it kind of naturally glue down. And what I'm using is this Plastron Bonding, which sets up pretty quickly, and it's working well to glue this onto this surface because it works with styrene, but it also works with ABS plastic. So this, I'm not sure what kind of plastic this is, but it's just hard plastic, so it works well. All right, so let me get and continue on around to that. And then once I get the whole thing on, I may do some rescribing of some of the lines. You can see that I put some little panels in, like right there, little space right there. I've already drilled one of the holes out for one of the rocket nozzles, and there'll be another one over on this side. And then I have to come up with some ideas of how to put that in there, possibly some epoxy sculpt, or if I can find some other plastic part that would work for that little curved section in there. So, all right. All right, so as you saw from the previous stills, I completed all the paneling, and I also completed the back part of the collar and added some little detail on there with some styrene flat strips. Put a little hole in it with a Dremel to look like a part of that. Now, when you look at it, and when I look at it, my first intuition is that it's the wrong scale. it doesn't look right. It looks like things are too big or too small or too out of proportion with each other, because your mind makes you want to think that this is half of the upper sphere, but it really isn't. It's maybe about a third of the whole sphere. It's only the top part. There's quite a bit more going down for the half part. So it just looks like it's kind of out of whack because your mind wants to focus on some of these bits and pieces, but it is quite accurate in scale, because as I showed early on, I literally sat this on top of the sphere and drew lines onto it with a marker so that I got exactly how it would look. So that part of the collar is just a little bit of it. It's a little piece, and that's where it would be located. And the rest of the collar obviously would come down and become flush and that kind of thing. So, all right, so I think it looks really awesome, and we've got how that turned out. So before I do any kind of painting, I'm working on some ideas to put those little exhaust nozzles or jets or whatever they are into those little holes. Excuse me. So what I kind of came up with is I still had an unpainted part of the sphere. Let me show you real quick. All right, so this is my board Discovery that I've done a lot of work on that I'm going to return to at some point. So this sphere is unpainted, and I still had one of the nozzles still there, unpainted and untouched. So what I did was I just took some polymer clay, oven-baked polymer clay, and I pressed it down into it to get a nice image of that, kind of a reverse image. I did it twice, and I ended up coming up with these little, like almost stamps, where it's the reverse. So if I stamp this into something else that's pliable, like the clay or something else like epoxy sculpt, it will get that image. So I played around with it, and what I initially wanted to try to do is I took some epoxy sculpt on this side and I pressed it up inside, as you can see, and this is hardened. And then I pressed that down into it. It's not terrible, but it's a little rough. It's hard because I was getting the epoxy sculpt sticking to it, like you can see on this one, and pulling away from it. So it was really hard. I had to try several times to get it. This one I just failed at all the attempts and gave up on it and just wanted to let that harden. So what I did was I took some epoxy sculpt and I put it in the freezer for a few minutes, let it get nice and cold, and it started to really get hard, not hardened, but just more solid, so it wasn't quite as sticky. And then when I took it out and I started kneading it before it warmed up again, I pressed it down into it, and it looks like a much nicer one. So what I want to try to do is I want to take my Dremel and sand around this one and kind of make a version that I can just take this one, it's already hardened, to just stick it down in here and see if that works. If that works for me, I'll go ahead and dig this one out and replace it with a better looking one. But that's not terrible, it's just not as nice and crisp as this one right here. You can see those little ridges and the little triangles and the circle. So let me get that in place, and then I'll see how that works. And then once I get these finally hashed out, I'll be ready to get a coat of primer and then start painting this. All right, so that worked out great. I did have to enlarge the hole a bit to fit that in there, but that looks really good. Looks a lot better than the other side. I'm gonna dig that back out and redo that one. I'm gonna have to cast another one, or probably two, just to be sure. The easiest way to get those holes nice and round is to use this bit right here. You just slowly put it in, and because this is round, it automatically rounds it out. And you want to do it slowly and little by little. That way you don't make it too big. I wanted that nice and snug, which it is, so it fits in there perfectly. So what I can do now is just glue it from behind, so there's no glue showing on the front. I'll just put some glue back there on the back, some 5-minute epoxy. That'll hold that in place, and it fits in there nice and snugly. It doesn't actually go all the way through the hole, which is good. So, but I think that looks fantastic. That looks great. So let me work on that other one, and then I'll be ready to go ahead and get some primer on this and start painting it. All right, so I glued in the second nozzle. That's all set up. Then I went back over and I took this flexible template that I got at Hobby Lobby. It's very flexible metal. And I held it along the lines, and I just used this scribing tool to just go through and scratch out the lines and make them just a little bit deeper. So when I put on the paint, the primer, it's going to have a little bit of lines to show in there. So I didn't do it on the top because this one isn't necessarily really grooved. These panels are panels. This is actually smooth. And then you achieve the different panel colors using some masking and different paints. So, okay, so this is all done. Turned out fantastically. Ready to go ahead and get a coat of fine surface primer from Tamiya on it. Once that dries, then I'll be able to start doing some painting with some dark grays and masking it, and then doing the 4 different color grays to achieve the different panels. All right. All right, so I put a coating of Tamiya Fine Surface Primer onto my base here, my scratch built top of the sphere. I went back over and did a little bit of sanding, and I rescribed the lines again a little bit more because the next step I'm going to do is to put on some dark gray. Then I'm going to mask off some panels, put on a neutral gray, mask off more, and then do like a light gray, and then do a blending coat over the whole thing like I did on the main pod. So, okay. So I'm ready to go ahead and do that with the dark gray, and we'll get this painted. All right, so as you saw on the previous stills, I got all the colors on, and then I pulled the masks off, and I went back over with a really light gray misting, which I had used on the Discovery that I built earlier. Shake that up, sorry, which is right here. I still had some. It's getting really low now, but all I did was I took some white in this separate bottle, and I just put a dab of some light gray into it just to give it a slight tint of some gray, because I didn't want pure white misted over top of it. Same with the Discovery. I didn't want pure white on the Discovery, so I went with a gray blending coat. So this is the completed top of the sphere, which is the base. I think that turned out really, really cool for being totally scratch built from a clear plastic ornament and a bunch of little bits and pieces that I put on. So let me go ahead and show you then. So I have, for the base, hold on one second. Let me get that and show you, not the base, but the case that it's going to be in. All right, so here's a display case that I got from Hobby Lobby. It's designed for a baseball. So it has this clear top, which comes off. It has the black plastic base, which is hollow underneath, which is just the right size for a battery, AAA battery compartment to fit inside. And it's just the right size measurement wise for this to fit inside here comfortably to be displayed. So it also has a clear piece, well, it had a clear piece that goes up into the top. You can see the top fits right onto that snugly, and then this piece fits down onto there. So what I did was I painted it black just to match, because I didn't want it to be clear. That hole in the back I made to match up this hole. That's where the brass rod is going to go through for the little pod to come up and bend over so it's over top of this. So you can see some of it's still clear because I didn't want to try to glue this onto a painted surface. So I put some masking around. I didn't have to do it in the middle because this is hollow. Nothing's going to be under this. Initially, I was thinking of having like the battery underneath this, but it doesn't have to be. With this base, it's perfect. What I can do is glue this down onto there. And I'll just line it up with the parts that I did, because I traced around it, and that's how I got the mask. So this is going to be glued permanently onto this piece of plastic, clear plastic, which is now painted. And that'll be glued onto this base. And then I'm going to have a brass tube going down. Let me see if I have that here. Something similar to this. I have to trim it down a bit, but it's going to go down into this, and it's going to come up over top of the command sphere base on an angle. I have to kind of play with it. I want it to be up a little bit. I don't want it really high up, but I want it to be up and kind of coming forward this way. Now, I realize that we don't really see that in any scenes from the movie, and I talked to my client about it. Because we're doing just this little pod as the model, and it's such a tiny little pod, it's only about a half an inch wide, it has to be on something that gives it a little more, you know, beefiness. So that's why I come up with the idea of this display here. Now normally the pod would be out here in the front, because this is the top of the sphere, this is the back where the collar is, this is the front. Right below this, down a little bit, because this is only about a third of the top of the sphere, you would have the cockpit, and the pod would be down in front of it facing it off. So, but I'm using a little bit of artistic license, since this is really the base itself, it's not the ship that it's displayed with. So I'm kind of getting the idea that the ship came back up because it had launched down to the starboard side, way away from it, to get the Frank body, and brought him back up. So we'll just pretend like it came up to catch up to the Discovery and came up over the top, and then it came up front, turned around, and faced it off on it. So that's how it's going to be positioned. And then the top will be removable, and he'll be able to just slide it over, and it's got a snug fit over top of this little clear part that I painted. And then if he wants to take it off and get a better look on the inside, that part's removable. But all of this will be together and solid. And then what I'll do is I'll wire a switch into the back that he can turn on. It's only going to have one switch to turn on the power, the lights. And then the rest of it will look nice and clean and have a nice thing. So, okay. So I'm ready to get this part glued on. I still have to work out this and the battery underneath. But I have a few more things to finish up on the pod as well, and then we'll start getting this all together. All right, so I'm not going to show a lot of video and detailing of building the pod and doing the main parts of it. It's just another version of the same pod that I built for my Discovery commission, which I completed recently. But I did want to highlight a few parts and a few things that I did a little differently, because obviously you learn from building the previous one, and so you make a little bit of changes. So here's a little figure of Frank. I think he turned out really cool. And I took a little bit of really thin styrene strip and I glued it on like it's the hose that's loose. Now somebody did point out to me, and it is a bit tricky to see because you only see maybe 30 seconds of video with him flying away trying to grab onto the hose and reattach it, that apparently the hose is still attached to his helmet but not to his side. So I reversed it. But I already have that on there. I'm not going to worry about it. Plus, he's going to be in the arms of the pod, so you're not really going to see, sorry for the focus, he's going to be positioned like this in the pod arms, so you're not really going to see too much of it because the hose goes from the side of his suit up until the side of his into the side of his helmet, and that's what the pod pulls out, or Hal pulls out with the pod, trying to kill him, and he succeeds. So so he turned out pretty cool. I really like how he turned out. The trick to this at these tiny little sizes is just to use the smallest amount of little paint on the tiniest brush that you have, and put on like those little black straps that hold on his air tanks. I use some Tamiya smoke on the helmet to kind of give it a glossy look, but make it dark because there's no detail there, of course. Tiny bits of silver on his wrists and on his ankles by his boots. Little teeny spots on the helmet to replicate the patches, which could not really be done at that scale. I still have to cut him off of the sprue and finish painting a little bit of orange on the back of that. There we go. That's that shot. That's a shot you often see of him just floating through space. One leg kind of askew. He did a good job in capturing the pose of him. So he'll look really cool in the claws. All right. I also painted the Frank figure. That's a partial figure that goes in the pod. And I started lighting the pod, and I put him in there. So there he is in the pod. And again, his face looks really rough because it's really hard to get any detail at this scale. But when he's inside and there are lights on, there's going to be red lights in there illuminating him. You're going to see that it's a figure, but it's not. You're not going to see that much of the details, especially through the front little tiny window, which is all you're going to see through. And you can see I painted the rest of the pod with the white, a little bit of silver accents here and there, the black on the front, that kind of thing. And I have the little side muffs and everything on it. So, all right. So I'm still working on some ideas for the lights, and then I'll get this together. And all of these wires are going to go down through that aluminum tube that I showed, down through the base, and they're going to be powered by a set of AA or AAA batteries. This is a AA battery set, but I'm going to use a AAA because it's a little thinner profile. So very close to the same. It has the same power, 3 volts, but a little less amps. But for just lighting the little lights in this, it should be just fine. So, all right. All right, so let me go over the wiring and the lighting, because I did a little bit of adjustments on it. I wasn't happy with how much you could see on the interior. So the way that it's set up is I have this little piece here that goes into the bottom. You can see those 2 little columns that are pre-built into it. I have 2 cool white nano SMDs glued into them. And then when you put it in the bottom, they match up with those little indentations, as you can see. And I have fiber optic going through the holes, which were pre-channeled for the headlights. There's also one for the Hal, which I'll show later when I get that going. So when this piece goes up inside, it lights those up. It also illuminates the controls. Well, the controls are just painted flat black. And then I took an X-Acto knife and scraped off little bits, and then went back and put some different color Tamiyas over top of them, like red, green, blue, and yellow, to give the idea of some detail and some controls. So besides that, I initially glued a Z SMD, which is super tiny. I'm trying to hold this right on the back here behind him. Then I put some, it was a cool white, it's either cool white or warm white, and I put some clear Tamiya red over it to give it a red tint, and it gave a nice glow inside the cabin when the roof was on. But the problem I was having is that it was showing him in silhouette, so you weren't really getting much detail on that figure. You could see something was in there, and you got a red glow, but I wanted to be able to see that there's a person in there. So I put another one. Let me get closer on that, sorry. And again, we're dealing with such a tiny, tiny little scale. But you can see that little bit of black styrene sticking up in front of him. Looks like he's holding like a book or something. Right behind it, and you can even make out the little teeny wire going next to his right arm, there's an SMD. And I put red over that as well. And that's going to glow from the front. The other one's going to glow from the back. And it's going to illuminate him nicely so that the cabin glows red, but also he glows red. So you can get a little more vision of him. So let me turn that on and show you what I mean. Okay. And that light obviously is not in it yet, so it's not lighting up the headlights or the controls. So there we go. So there's a light in the back. There's a light in front of him, basically in his lap, that illuminates him from the front, which is really cool. But I didn't want you to see the direct light because that would affect how it looked. It wouldn't look right. Like he had this big glowing light in front of him. I still have to do a little bit of painting around it to mask in around the front part so you're not going to see it. I'll probably just put some color Tamiya's on there to give it more of a control look. Sorry for the shakiness, but at this scale, it's really hard to get a picture. Let me put the roof on it, and I'll show you how that's going to look with the roof on it, which is really, really cool. All right, and again, I apologize for the very close-up shakiness, but really awesome. So you can actually see inside there and see that there is a full interior. There's a little Dave figure. You can almost kind of make out that he has some facial features, but they're just really rough, of course. You can see his arms. Once I get the bottom light in, you're going to see the controls lit up a little bit in front of him. But the main thing I wanted to achieve by adding in the additional light, was to really get an image that there's an interior and a person in there, which I think that accomplishes. That is really, really cool. So especially at this scale, with this being the model, this is the model on the base, I wanted this to really stand out and showcase just how amazing the interior is, how incredibly well done this 3D printed ship was made with an interior and figures and everything else. So I think that's really, really cool. And you can make out some really cool detail. I am going to put a window in this. I did initially put one window in. It's right there. I took it back out. It wasn't quite straight. You can see some of the edges, so I'm going to redo it. There's a nice lip inside that window to put one in so I can glue it without putting some crazing on the plastic or the window. So, but really, really awesome. Really, really cool. All right. All right, and there is the light in the bottom of the pod. I tried lining up the fiber optic for the little howl light there that you can see. It's just such an odd angle because it has to go through the roof part that slides down and then down through into the bottom where it hits the light. So I took a fine pin vise and drilled it through, and it just drilled it into the part of the ship but not down into the bottom, which actually put some light into it. It's kind of hard to see it in this light, but I'll turn the lights off here in a second and you'll see it a little bit better. So it shows up better in real life, so I think that's going to be the way to go. And I put a little bit of a red Tamiya on it. So all right, but you can see into the cockpit there. See a little Dave figure. And I showed a picture previously of the windshield that I put on, that I cut out, which looks really nice. If I take it up on the top, you can make out the little controls inside, kind of wrap around him. And again, they're just little specks of light and color, but they just add to it and give you the impression that there's more going on inside there than there really is. But I especially love that you can see the full cockpit, and it looks even more amazing in real life that you can look inside there and see the little figure. So I really like how I lit up the front of him and the back of him So you see the red glow in the back, but you also see the figure itself and can make out some detail. Of course, the headlights looking fantastic. I did a little bit of touching up some black around the bottom base that goes in there. I'll have to do some more once I get that glued in place. All right, let me go and turn off the light and I'll show you how that looks without a light on. All right. So you can see, you can make out the little how, sorry for the little, what are those things called? J.J. Abrams, the the little light reflections. But you can make out the little how, and he's certainly visible. It's a little deeper red in real life as well. You can make out inside the cockpit. See the controls a little better without a lot of bright lights shining on them. Here it is coming towards you. And of course, a lot of that, like the howl light and things like that, you're gonna have claws on the front of this, and you're gonna have the little Frank figure in the claws. So the whole overall effect's gonna be pretty amazing and pretty awesome. Plus, you're gonna see that there's clearly a figure of Dave in the cockpit, which is really cool. So, all right. So I'm ready to get and button up the bottom here and get these wires run through a brass tube once I get that cut to length, and then I can start getting it positioned where it needs to be onto the base. Alright, so I showed in the previous stills, I got the dome glued onto this piece here that I painted black that was clear. Then I got that glued down onto the plastic base. Underneath, well, in the back, I drilled out a hole for the switch and glued it in there. And I glued the battery pack onto the bottom. Right now, nothing's wired up. I just have the wires coming through. I also painted that that brass rod, their tube there, flat black. Let that dry, and then I glued it into the base there. So what I'm going to do now is I just need to glue the pod onto the tube, and I went ahead and glued on the claws so I could position it and know when it's going to be straight, because I have to put some 5-minute epoxy underneath where the tube connects and just straighten it out so it's facing forward the correct way. So I'm going to go ahead and get that done, and then I'll just need to glue in the figure, the Frank body, and wire the wires up, and then I'll be ready to do the final reveal. And here is the completed pod on its scratch-built command sphere top base. I think that turned out fantastically. And the lights look a lot more realistic in real life. The red is a much deeper red. It looks more accurate to the film than it looks in the camera. The camera tends to wash it out a lot. Let me see if I can get closer in. Sorry. There we go. All right, so you can definitely make out that there's a figure in there. And like I said, in real life too, you can see inside the cabin. It's pretty cool. You can make out the little controls. Poor little Frank in the claws. I did fix his little air hose, so it's coming out of his helmet now. If you can see that there, it's kind of hard. And like I said, you're not going to see much of it. You got to look real close. Sorry. There it is underneath. You can see hanging down. But it's coming out of his helmet because I realized, and I should have known this because I built the bigger one. The bigger one up on my wall right there. The hose comes out of his helmet and it goes back into his backpack at the top. It doesn't go into his side. He has other connectors that go in the sides that go into the backpacks, but not from the helmet. So that's where he would have been trying to grab it. So pretty sweet. Let me go ahead and put the clear lid on it. It's just harder to film with the lid on it because you get a lot of reflection. All right, and there's a protective lid on top. I don't know if I had mentioned earlier in the video or mentioned before, this was designed for a baseball. I got it from Hobby Lobby, but it's really nice because I was able to flip it on its lid and all of that's connected inside, so all I had to do was turn it upside down and I was able to work on the wiring pretty easily. So there's the two AAA batteries and the holder, which is glued down. I have the switch in the back. I have the wires coming out, going into it. And then I just use some UV glue to glue it down. You can see in those couple of spots. That works pretty good for a little tack welding like that, just to keep the wiring nice and flat. And this base is great because the bottom is just the right height that battery fits underneath without any problems. And then I have the switch on the back. Turn it on and off. It's really easy. It's hidden away. All right, very beautiful, very beautiful. I just have it rigged up with some black background here so you can see it a little bit better. All right, very happy with that. So that is all ready to go to my client to finish this commission. All right, so that's going to wrap up this this build. It's only a one video build, obviously, for my second commission. So very happy with how it turned out. I think it looks fantastic, and gives me a chance to be a little more creative with this tiny little pod. So I will be posting more videos coming up for the buddy build on the ATST. I've been working on that on my part of it, and so has Tim, and also working on a few other things which I'll be doing some posts here coming up in the future as well. So thank you to all my new subscribers, and I will see you next time.